I want to thank John and the CCF for helping particularly to sponsor this event. Some of the student groups are taking more ownership, and so we appreciate them helping out tonight. And we're really grateful that they're going to stay afterwards and clean up, right? Again, I'm Len Tang. I'm one of the project leaders for Science and Faith Examined. I'm on staff at Fuller Seminary, and I'm also starting a new church here in Pasadena called Missio. We're thrilled that Dr. Warren Brown could be with us. He and I actually got to have lunch last year to talk about some of these related issues, so we're really thrilled that you're here. Warren Brown directs the Lee Edward Travis Research Institute at Fuller Seminary here in Pasadena, and he's the professor of psychology there as well. He's been a member of the UCLA Brain Research Institute since 1982 and got his doctorate in experimental physiological psychology, it's a mouthful, from USC. Before coming to Fuller, he spent 11 years as a research scientist at the UCLA Brain Research Institute and was also a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion. So he's done a lot of this integrative work as well along the way. He's written many books and lectured on the integration, specifically of neuroscience and the Christian faith. And he's actually currently working on a Templeton-funded project with a Caltech professor, Stephen Quartz, and that study is called Love, Compassion, and Care, Virtue, Science, and Exemplarity in Real Life and in the Laboratory. Maybe you'll tell us what that means later on. So anyway, we're grateful. Anyway, great to have you here. Let's please welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm just sort of up the road a little ways, but I do interact with Ralph Adolph's lab here at Fuller in neuroscience and neuropsychology. I actually have one of my students working with Ralph here at Caltech, so I'm actually sort of collaborative here, but have not had an opportunity to be a part of this group or to be with you. I'm going to be talking about some things that are to some degree out of my primary science area. So let me tell you about what I do as a scientist, and then we'll move on to some things that are more philosophical. I'm interested in brain function, and I'm particularly interested in the functions of the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is the brain on your left is a normal brain. That is actually my brain. So normal is in quotes. We're not totally sure. And I'm interested in studying the functions of the corpus callosum, which is an interconnective pathway between the right and left cerebral hemispheres, about 200 million neurons. And the way we study it is to study individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum, or absence of the corpus callosum. This is a congenital brain abnormality in which the 200 million neurons of the corpus callosum just are not there. And so you can see there quite clearly the big white structure on my brain and the absence of that structure in this individual with agenesis of the corpus callosum. So my students and I have spent about 20 years studying that and trying to understand the nature of the outcome. So the cognitive disabilities that we have found in individuals who have that disorder and have their intelligence in a normal range. These people are not retarded by any means, but they have certain areas of cognitive disability that we've been able to put together over the last 20 years. One is they have problem integrating information from the two visual fields, information occurring on this side of the visual field, that side need to be integrated, and they have problems doing that. They can do it, but they don't do it well. They have problem coordinating the movement of the two hands, things like tying your shoes. And they can do it, but again, they're slow in doing it and not very agile or accurate. They particularly have problems in complex novel problem solving, and this we think is a core cognitive deficit. Absence of the corpus callosum means you are slower and less efficient at solving complex novel problems. And slow, they also have problems in cognitive processing time. They just process information more slowly. comprehension of non-literal language, idioms, proverbs, humor. They just don't quite get the second-order meaning of language that would be necessary to understand a proverb, for example. Proverbs have a concrete meaning, but there's a secondary meaning that actually carries the important social meaning of that proverb. They have they have deficiencies in the subtle nuances of social interactions. In a sort of slang way, they appear socially clueless. They don't quite get everything that is going on, but they're kind of there, but missing some things. And they have problems in imagination and creativity. So what I do and what my students do primarily is research on agenesis of the corpus callosum. Len mentioned a study on virtue and exemplarity, and that's a study I got into with Steve Quartz here at Fuller and some other investigators that really is kind of distant from my primary area. This actually is my primary research area, and there's a whole story behind how I got involved in that research. That research area has led myself and my students into relationship with a whole lot of families that have an individual with agenesis of the corpus callosum in their family. So about, 15 years ago or more, we started the National Organization of Disorders of the Corpus Callosum, and every year, or every other year now, we have a national conference, and all these people come with their person with agenesis of the corpus callosum and family members, and we try to share with them what we've been learning in our research. And Werder asked me to say something about how I understand my science in relationship to my Christian faith. And one of the privileges and blessings I've had in life is the ability to do research in an area that is deeply important and meaningful to the people in this organization. And Jesus said something about when you do it under the least of these, my brethren, you do it for me or to me. And this is an opportunity to do research in an area where we know very directly what the impact on the lives of these families are. We go to these meetings, and my student, maybe doing research on memory and agenesis of the corpus callosum, and they're at the meeting, and family come up, you're studying memory and agenesis of the corpus callosum? Let me tell you about the memory in my son. And so they go all this, and so now my students go away thinking, wow, what I'm doing is really important to somebody. So that has been, a blessing to me for sure. So I do all this, I just got back actually from the Australian disorders of the corpus callosum, so the American version of this, a national organization, spun off the Australian version, and so there's a whole lot of people in Australia that also kind of look at what we do and find it helpful. So I do this work at Fuller Theological Seminary, and when you're doing neuropsychology, neuroscience at Fuller Seminary, you get pulled into, dragged into, whatever, a lot of conversations that are beyond neuroscience itself. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of the work I've done with philosopher Nancy Murphy in a book we did several years ago called Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? The point of the book was to deal with, in a philosophical way primarily, not so much theological, but philosophical way, the problem of reductionism and determinism in science, and particularly neuroscience, with respect to human beings. So if humans are in fact neurobiological beings, does that mean that they are determined in some way? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little about determinism in the philosophy of mind, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about embodiment. It's part of the answer to the question. I won't be able to do that section justice. But I am going to talk about emergence in complex dynamical systems, which I think is an important area of information that helps us understand why we would not presume that a complex system like a human being, even if you believe that person to be physical, to be necessarily reducible to neurons and determined in that way. And then I'll just give some conclusions. This, by the way, our book was reviewed in Science, and this is the little cartoon they had by the book review. So first, some ideas about determinism. What I want to do is fit you into a outline of philosophy so that you can understand what the problem is and where the solution I'm going to talk about stands in that philosophical construct. So I get this outline from my philosopher colleague Nancy Murphy. So I'm not a philosopher, but she is, and this is her outline. So anyway, so if you think about theories of mind, or how do you understand mind, one way is the classic body-soul or body-mind dualism, that the mind or the soul is a non-material thing, and the body is a material thing, and these are separate and different, and that all of that we want to presume to be true of human nature versus the animal world, for example, is a part of or attributable to a non-material thing like a soul or mind, and those are blurred in a lot of the philosophy. So this comes a lot from Plato, whole idea of the realm of the non-material being the real, and the material being merely the reflections of what is there in the world of the forms. This comes to us also through St. Augustine. We were just having a comment about St. Augustine. And Augustine was basically a Neoplatonist, so he basically picked up his ideas from Plato. And Augustine linked this Platonic material, non-material dualism to a spirituality of inwardness. That is, the non-material part of us is something inside, and therefore spirituality is something hidden inside individual persons, which I find problematic, but that's a discussion for another time. And of course, Rene Descartes gave us that sort of most discrete and most recent version of body-soul dualism, the strongest distinction with a rational mind or soul and an irrational body that was hierarchically, inferior to the mind or soul, however you want it. So that's body-soul dualism. So here's the problems, I think, with the Cartesian view. First of all the important events and all that is essential about persons are inside, hidden inside. They're part of a non-material thing inside the person. Second is, since the hierarchically privileged inner soul or mind or self, whatever terminology you want to use, is private, and therefore persons are isolated and essentially independent of their outward behavior and of community. And thirdly, this fosters a commitment to inwardness and individuality. And I am a Christian. I'm particularly interested in the nature of Christian community, and I think this Cartesian understanding of persons makes it difficult to think about that. And that's a whole other discussion. We can go on a long time about that. So the problem with dualism in the science realm is something like this. It's becoming increasingly difficult to find an area of human cognitive, affective, social, or religious functioning that has not already been shown to have correlates in identifiable brain activity. So I go around giving talks about brain processes and religious experience. I actually try to kind of deconstruct it. But there is lots of studies on religious experience and brain correlates. And then, of course, social functioning, social cognitive neuroscience is a very important area right now, and so forth. So if that is true, then if the brain is doing all these things or participating in all of this, what does a soul or a mind or a self do that the brain or body is not doing? So what do you assign in terms of causes and roles to the non-material, soul, mind, self, whatever it is, if in fact we have pretty good and increasingly good neuroscience with respect to these functions in humans. So that's the problem with dualism. So it doesn't totally deconstruct dualism, but it does mean that it's a harder and harder position to maintain. So another possibility is physicalism, that we're not a non-material thing and a material thing. We are material beings. We are physical beings in the world. And there's two versions of that idea. Well, monism actually is the primary category. You can be a monist idealist, which means there is no physical world. All we know to be true is ideas in the mind, and you just can't argue that there is any physical world at all. The other possibility is physicalism. That is, what we are as physical beings. One version of that is eliminative materialism, and that's an important concept for what we want to talk about tonight. Eliminative materialism, one version of physicalism. Basically, the logic is, and this logic in modern physics doesn't quite hold up as tightly as it has in the past, but the idea that physical processes are subject to the deterministic laws of physics, that the brain is a physical object, and it is the basis of all thought and behavior. Thus, brain processes and resulting behavior are governed by the laws of physics and determined at some lower level. Therefore, my neurons made me do it. That whatever expresses itself in my thought and behavior can be reduced to, and therefore presumed to be determined by, things happening at the level of neurons or even below the level of neurons at synaptic functions or membrane functions or the neurochemistry of the membrane functions or whatever. It's a reductionism and a determinism that comes out of this basically logic. Therefore, conscious mental life is epiphenomenal. It's not a real cause of behavior. If you believe this reductionist determinist line, then your thoughts cannot be actually causes of your behavior. The real causes, what's really real, is down at the level of the functions of neurons. All right? So that's eliminative materialism. A good friend of mine passed away some years ago. Donald Mackay was a neuroscience and also a Christian and a writer of books. And I actually discovered him reading a InterVarsity book, whole story there that's kind of interesting. Anyway, Donald Mackay coined the term nothing buttery for this eliminative materialism position. So he says, according to this view, only where physical explanation was impossible could any other account be taken seriously in its own right. Otherwise, the whole thing could be explained away as nothing but the mindless motion of molecules. I love that phrase, the mindless motion of molecules. All right, that's Donald Mackay. Philosopher Douglas Hofstadter makes the same point in this way in his book called I Am a Strange Loop. Hofstadter says, is what goes on inside our heads just a deterministic physical process? If so, are we all, no matter how idiosyncratic and sparkly, nothing but slaves to rigid laws governing the invisible particles out of which our brains are built? Could creativity ever emerge from a set of rigid rules governing minuscule objects? So that is the issues raised by eliminative materialism, and to some degree have in the past, I think increasingly less so, been an assumption behind a lot of human neuroscience. That basically, if we just knew enough, we could explain it away by things happening at the neural or molecular level itself. So here's the question. Is there an alternative to eliminative materialism that we just talked about, other than Cartesian dualism, that is consistent with modern neuroscience, in which mental life plays a causal role? The decisions you make and the thinking you do is causal in the world, and in which human beings have genuine interpersonal relationships, moral agencies, and religious experiences? Is there a position somewhere between body-soul dualism, which is kind of hard to maintain in the modern world of neuroscience, and eliminative materialism that has all kinds of philosophical problems associated with it, particularly when you come to trying to understand human life and human nature? So that's a good question. So I think the answer is there's another kind of physicalism, and that is an emergent version of physicalism, which Nancy Murphy and I in writing called non-reductive physicalism, but other writers call emergent monism, or dual aspect monism, or pluralistic holism. I mean, there's a number of people who have fundamentally the same point of view that use a little bit different terminology. And what I want to do primarily today is just kind of give you some explanation of that emergent view, and then that will be what you can talk about a bit. So basically, that physicalism means, part of that means it's not necessary to postulate a second entity, the soul or mind, to account for human capacities and distinctiveness. That souling and minding are physiological processes. They're physiologically embodied. What we mean by emergence is that thought and behavior are based on large patterns of interactions of parts, neurons or subneuron parts or whatever, and cannot be exhaustively explained by analysis of the parts. Higher level causal properties emerge from patterns of functioning of the parts. That's basically the argument for emergence. So this says, generally, the points I argue about, and we'll take up some of this today, is that the mind, therefore, is embodied. It's a physical process involving the body as well as the brain. It's embedded, present in contextualized action in the world. You cannot extract the brain or a person from their ongoing interactions with the context in which they are embedded. It is emergent. It arises out of patterns of interactivity in the parts that make us up, and is extended, can incorporate things outside the body. So I'm going to talk about embodied and emergent, primarily emergent. I'll give a little bit of what I think about embodiment, because that term is used, and I use it a little bit differently than it's used in a lot of philosophy. So embodiment, let's talk about it for just a minute, and then we'll get to the idea of emergence. So the term embodiment can simply mean mind is a bodily physical process. So non-reductive physicalism and all those emergent point of views basically uses the term embodiment to mean this is a physical process. I actually prefer the ideas around embodied cognition. The embodied cognition says that mental processes are rooted in sensory motor interactions of the body with the world. That's not just the brain. It's the whole body interacting the world that is the fundamental basis of mental life. And therefore, all aspects of minding, cognition, are shaped by the nature of the body. So I go to a church where the children sing a song called If I Were a Butterfly, and one of the verses of that is, if I were an elephant, I'd thank the Lord for my long trunk, or something like that. So if I were an elephant and had the brain of a human being, had my brain, but I had an elephant's body, I would have a very different mind. It's because mind comes about by bodily interaction with the world. Therefore, the nature of the body influences the nature of mind. If I had a different body, my mind would be built, organized around a different set of experiences in the world. For example, I would manipulate things with a trunk, and therefore my experience of things would be very different if I were manipulating them with the end of my trunk than if I were manipulating them with my hands. So embodiment for me means more than just physical, it means really embodiment. It means that my cognitive processes are not just stuck in my brain, but my brain and my body. So the principles of embodied cognition, this takes a whole lecture, this slide. So I will just blow through them real quickly. Cognition is for action. Cognition is situated. It always takes place in some context, always embedded. Cognition is time pressured. You cannot stop the brain. The brain is always ongoing. And it's action, and therefore cognition is enmeshed in recurrent feedback with the world, so that ongoingness cannot be extracted from its sensory motor feedback with the world in which we are embedded. Meaning of language is rooted in the recall of sensory motor experience, whole linguistic set of arguments there. Offline cognition is body-based. This is a really important point, I think, and that is the first thing you say is, wait a minute. When I go home and sit in my chair and I think about stuff, I'm not acting, I'm just sitting there. But if you be conscious of what it is you're doing when you're sitting there, you are actually simulating in your head sensory motor actions of the world, some of which are linguistic. You're talking to yourself. Some of which are visual spatial. You're seeing things. Things are images are appearing to your mind. Anyway, lots of things to be said there. And then some cognitive work is offloaded into the environment, and that's a whole area that I'm working on right now. So a version of this can be seen in Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, idea about Cartesian materialism. So classic Cartesianism is the idea that there is in the head somewhere, inside the person, a little homunculus, another little person, and it's that person that processes the world. And we call that person a self or a soul or a mind, but it functions like another person inside the cell. And what Dennett has pointed out is that in modern neuroscience, basically we have Cartesian materialism, that is a body and an inner brain, rather than a body and an inner mind or soul. So this idea of embodied cognition blurs the distinction between, it puts brain as an important nucleus in the activity of the whole body in the world. But, so much for embodiment. So one of the possibilities for physicalism that's different than limited in materialism is emergence, which means it takes the position of we are physically embodied persons, but we have emergent properties that are not reducible. So let me explain what that means. So the theory of complex dynamical systems gives a plausible account of the emergence of high-level causal properties in complex interactive systems. High level in that they operate in a more sophisticated and complex way than the operation of the parts themselves, and the emergent properties of the pattern of interactivity actually is a cause in the world. New causes emerge. So a more technical definition, that is how complex, nonlinear, highly interactive aggregates become systems through adaptive self-organization, and how patterns of organization are causal in their own right. So, anybody that talks about emergent talks about ant colonies. So let me talk about ant colonies. So if I had a bucket of ants, 100,000 ants, and we were out on the dirt, and I dumped those ants on the dirt, they would be running and scurrying around, and they would be an aggregate. They would just be scurrying around. If we came back a few months later, and those ants had survived, they would survive by having become a system. That is, they would have organized themselves in ways to create the kind of systems that functions in the world in ways that allow for their survival. They would build nests, they would forage for food, some ants would take out the garbage, some ants would take out dead ants to the cemetery. There actually is a cemetery in ant colonies. Some ants would be tending to the queen, and this would all be entirely a self-organizing process. There is no command ant. The queen ant is the most passive of all the ants in the colony. They self-organize by patterns of interaction with each other in a way to create patterns of organization that are causal in the world. They cause things to happen. They survive. They get food, they build a nest, all kinds of things happen out of the patterns of interaction. So, a system, as opposed to an aggregate, functions as a unified system. Colony actions or system actions are actions and characteristics are not due to the decisions of individual ants. We already talked about, there's no command ant. Actions of individual ants become entrained by the system. So as things begin to organize in a kind of self-organizing process, what any particular ant does becomes constrained by the pattern of interactions around it, the ants around it. So any particular ant does one thing or another because of the nature of the things happening in the ants around it. It has a place and a pattern. The system properties are due to self-organization in response to the environment. The colony self-organizes. There's no pre-pattern of organization particularly, and there's no command ant. And systems become causes. So things like a ant mound, or whatever you call an ant colony mound, get built out of this sense of organization. So the properties that are necessary for complex systems, and here I'm trying to bridge to the brain, for example, is complexity, a very large number of elements, for example, a lot of neurons. Maximal interconnectivity, very large number of synapses per neuron, huge amount of interconnectivity. Two-way interactions between elements involving recurrent connections and feedback. So not only are they connected, but they're connected in ways that create both local and long-distance feedback loops, which is a fundamental characteristic of the way the brain processes information. Lots of recurrent feedback. Nonlinear interactions that amplify small perturbations and small differences in initial conditions. They have to be complex and dynamic in that sense. So the characteristics of a complex system self-organizes, we've talked about that. Elements become entrained or bind each other into large patterns of interconnectivity that interface with the environment. Ultimately, a colony interfaces with the environment not sort of ant by ant, but by colony properties. So the organizational patterns of the colony become what it is that's effective in interfacing with the environment. Large perturbations of the system cause reorganization and adaptability. So if a ant colony is operating and seems to be surviving, and the food availability changes, the colony has got to reorganize itself. So it is always it organizes originally, but it's always dynamically open to ongoing reorganizations. Continued reorganization creates more complex and nuanced forms of organization and adaptability. And you can particularly demonstrate this in a lot of different kinds of complex systems. But each organization doesn't lose the previous level of organization. It actually builds on top of it another kind of form of that, and so each time the system reorganizes. This, for me, is a great description of child development. Organization of a complex system in relationship to the environment, but their environment begins to shift a little, and so they have to reorganize, and they become a little more complex and nuanced, and then more things happen, and complex and nuanced. Then mom and dad begin to talk to them, and they have to gain language, so they have to reorganize in ways that incorporate a whole language system, and then they go to school, and all kinds of social things change, and on and on and on. So other examples of complex systems, this is from John Holland's book on emergence, a good place to go to read on this if you want. For example, he says there is emergence in chess. Now, it's not a causal emergence in that the chess pieces go up and do things in the world, but in terms of the emergence of complex patterns based on very simple rules. You have 32 pieces, an 8x8 board, and approximately 20 rules, and in chess you get incredibly complex, not quite infinite, I suppose, but seemingly infinite number of possibilities in chess. So there can emerge patterns based on simple rules. Another example he gives of biological growth in trees. You begin with a seed or whatever, and you have basic patterns of things, but how a tree grows is emergent in the sense that its configuration has a lot to do with its current state in relationship to the environment. So if things get warmer, the tree grows certain ways, things are wetter, if there are other trees around, the whole shape of the tree is not predetermined but is emergent in the sense of its interactions with its environment. And of course, computer neural networks and self-modifying or learning computer programs have emergent properties. They organize in one way. If it's an open architecture and continually interacting with the environment, it can reconfigure itself in ways that it becomes more and more intelligent in the sense of its operation in its environment. So those are just examples that Holland gives of emergence. Nancy Murphy and I, in our book, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It?, had written the whole book and thought we had a pretty good book. And then we read Alicia Herrero's book, Dynamics in Action, which is a book about Aristotelian philosophy partly, but mostly it's a book about dynamical systems. And we read that and realized we've got to go back and rewrite our book, because we had used the term emergence in a sort of hand-waving way. We had no idea really what might be an explanation for an emergent property. And so we went back and rewrote our book. So Alicia Herrero says the higher level of organization, each time a complex system reorganizes, whether thermodynamic, psychological, or social, possesses a qualitative different repertoire of states and behaviors than the earlier level, as well as greater degrees of freedom. So each time the system reorganizes, it has greater degrees of freedom, and that there are more parts of the environment it can interact with in an agentive way. And again, I think that's what's happening in child development. As children develop, they develop greater and greater degrees of freedom, possibilities of doing things in the world as they reorganize over time. So this is just for free. I got to thinking about this ant thing. And so I thought, how many neurons, what are we talking about here? So I found out that ant brains have around 250,000 neurons. That's not a bad number of neurons. And a colony has about 700,000 ants, depending on the species. 300,000, 700, something in there. Different species, different amount, but something like that. And ants communicate with each other primarily by pheromones, but also a little bit by contact, but a little contact and a lot of pheromone interactions. Humans have 100 billion neurons, which is equivalent in total neurons to an ant colony of 400,000. So a lot of ant colonies have more neurons than the human brain. Why aren't ant colonies smarter? Why aren't there emergent in ant colonies more sophisticated cognitive processes? Well, the difference is human brains have 100 trillion synapses. So the difference in what emerges is the richness of interconnectivity, the degree to which you can have very sophisticated interactive patterns that are modifiable, all the synapses are modifiable, and dynamic in the sense that as the person interacts with the world, there's a possibility of increasingly complex patterns of interactivity. So that's kind of for free. So, conclusions? Did my neurons make me do it? No, I did it. I am a whole integrated body-brain. I, as an entire body, brain, think and act. I have causal properties of me. The mental and behavioral properties of me are emergent based on the patterns of organization of all the parts of me, all the brain parts of me as well as all the body parts of me. And I have been and am being formed by my interactions with the world. I continually learn and am formed, and you know, when you get to be an old guy, it doesn't work quite as well as when you are young, but you know. So, that's what I have. So I think you have questions about, and so I think the basic discussion idea is, is this a credible alternative in your mind to either eliminative materialism or body-soul dualism in the context of a understanding of humans that is richly human? That makes sense? I think you have questions that are somewhat down that line. Anyway, thank you. Okay. Yeah, great. Yeah.
So I have two kind of questions. The first one is, both of them are in the same vein. So first question is basically, do you know, I mean, if you program a CPU, it will be deterministic.
It will be what?
It will be deterministic.
Yeah.
Correct? Even with it has at least one of the properties that you mentioned for emergence, which is complexity.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of transistors
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
number of
Yeah.
up to 10 billion. So
Yeah.
it at least has one property of emergence, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have,
Yeah.
and it has interconnectivity.
Yeah.
But it's still deterministic.
Yeah.
So can you define, like, what's the difference between
Yeah, the difference is, first of all, I think the computer is a bad model for brains. I think brains are not computers. And I think that's trapped us philosophically into a lot of problems. But that a computer system, I think, will begin to demonstrate this kind of emergence as it is both interactive with the world and modifiable progressively based on that interaction. So the neural networks that learn things are interactive with the environment in ways that are continually self-modifying of the system based on the outcomes of interactions with the world. So I think that's, you guys probably can answer that question better than I can.
We're having a great discussion about the intersection between observing systems,
Yeah.
explore space, or
Yeah.
monitoring Earth. So that's now taking in, capturing the data, how we begin to intersect that with learning and extracting insight, and how we can self-organize so that you can evolve systems.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's happened, that was a very sophisticated explanation of the little bit I know, but the little bit I know is that the systems in which you can program a lot of fairly simple systems operating by fairly simple interactive rules. And as they begin to interact with each other, there are properties that emerge in the interactions that you didn't program, or you don't have to program. So now modern robotics is about programming open systems that modify by interaction with the environment rather than prior deterministic computer programming. Yep. But you guys, I'm sure that a lot of you guys know this better than I. Yeah.
And I have kind of a follow-up
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
Would you call the ant colony deterministic?
No, not as a colony. When they are an aggregate and they are rounding around, you have a bunch of individual ants that you might think about as, in some sense, at least because of their simplicity, more deterministic, but they're still interacting with the environment. What happens that is emergent is when they begin to, because of the pressure of the environment, have to interact with each other in ways that any particular ant does what it does because of its place in the pattern of inactivity of the whole colony. And so there is emergence of non-deterministic, in the sense that agentive interaction with the environment that is based on what the environment has been, not necessarily based on just properties inside individual ants.
But wouldn't the idea of it being deterministic like include the environment? So I guess.
Yeah, okay, well, Eric, Rich, excuse me.
A JPL perspective on that. We're often, one of the challenging things we're always trying to think through from an engineering sense is, we send our rovers, our spacecraft to Mars, and they have certain kinds of autonomous capability. And this question of determinism often comes up, because we'd like to have an idea that we can predict what the system will do, before it arrives on Mars. And where that begins to break down a bit is that we can't fully predict what the Mars environment is going to throw at the system in an operational sense. So when that word determinism comes up, from a programming perspective, it is deterministic. You present the system and its software with the exact same set of conditions twice, it will behave the same. The problem is when you get into the complexity, say, of the surface environment of Mars, you can no longer fully predict or model what the environment's going to throw at you. And so that gets you out of the realm of determinism. And this is very problematic when you're trying to build a system that's autonomous in the sense that it will do something reasonable, even under conditions that you can't fully predict, which I think is very consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah.
How systems
Yeah.
operate in the world.
One of the traps is to have only in mind complete physical determinism and absolute free will. That's a philosophical, categorical trap. Because what is being described here is an agent that self-organizes in a way to interact as an agent with the world based on its history, which I think is sufficient for human life and human interactivity and human relationships and human morality, which is where I'm trying to get. Yeah.
So if the human brain is irreducible to its components and individual firing the neurons,
Yeah.
does it mean that modern neuroscience is mistaken in trying to find networks and localized functions in the brain?
Well, no. I mean, I participate in modern neuroscience, and I'm interested in what are the things that are less likely to emerge or emerge less robustly when 200 million neurons that interconnect the right and left cerebral hemisphere are not there. The interconnectivity is reduced. So to study the parts is important for our understanding of the nature of us as physical beings. But anytime we study something in the brain, like we're studying the role of the amygdala in fear for a second, as soon as you're studying the amygdala, actually the thing you're most interested in has, to some sense, disappeared in your reduction. That you're looking at properties of the amygdala, but the experience of fear and fear as a behavioral interaction with the world is somehow now, in terms of the experiment, has had to be sort of controlled. And so I participate in modern neuroscience very, as much as I can given the skill area I have. But I don't think that the net conclusion needs to be reductive. There is a version of reductionism that we need to do in order to study a property, which means basically we hold constant a whole lot of stuff, which means we've reduced the property we want to study down to what we will allow to vary in our study, and the other things that we want to hold constant actually begin to reduce the property that we want to study. And then we study that property. But my view is that it participates in, ultimately, in the whole of the human person as a person interacts with things, for example, that are fearful. Yeah.
I've not heard it much, and I almost wonder if it's been addressed. And that is from the Bible side in Genesis, for those who consider Genesis 1 a material description,
Yeah.
a physical description. In verses 20 and 21, where the oceans are swarming, there's the first word, Hebrew word, nephesh.
Yeah.
There, first
Yeah.
time, which is translates into
Yeah.
soul.
Yeah.
Those nephesh, those swarming creatures, if we team it up with the Cambrian explosion, where nephesh means to breathe,
Yeah.
were the first animals that breathed, were
Yeah.
the first animals that
Yeah.
had water cords.
Yeah.
Then later comes spirit,
Yeah.
and it's almost like humans had the extra level upon the nephesh, finally developed to where there was the higher development. And now, in Greek, I don't know if they would agree with that. I just wondered, I hear that the two levels, the two entities, versus monism and so forth, but I wondered if anybody's ever considered from the Bible two physical developmental levels, one on top of the other.
Oh, yeah, I don't know any biblical scholar does that, but I don't know that I would make it distinct levels, but I certainly think that the possibility for emergent property in humankind has expanded enormously. Yeah. Yeah. And that part of that is physical, part of that also is social, in terms of culture, that there are things that are happening. So, I totally agree. There's something about humankind that has emerged in ways that have created almost a whole nother level or something. I don't know exactly how to express that, but yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. Yeah.
You mentioned in your embodiment section that when we, like, in terms of thinking,
Yeah.
we're in offline
Yep.
cognition, but it's
Yep.
a simulation.
Yep.
Would you think of dreaming, like when you're sleeping,
Yeah.
as the same
Yep.
thing, or would it be a bit different? Because in the sense of you're sitting in a chair and thinking, you're still kind of cautious of like what's around you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in a sleep state, you just have your essentially brain running.
I would think about dreaming as unconstrained simulations and emulations, but unconstrained. So when we are saying about thinking, they're constrained in the sense that our consciousness of them kind of moves them along in a coherent way, in ways that in dreaming it's unconstrained.
Your statement about it's this motion, or like motions in the like in your synapses that's causing what you're thinking, because you're not really controlling what you're thinking in the sense of like when you're sitting.
I don't think so. I mean I don't see that as contradictory. One of the things that this all idea of embodied cognition, simulation, and emulation was there in the philosophical literature 30 years ago. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Rizzolatti and others in Italy discovered mirror neurons. They are neurons that are in our sensory motor systems that operate when we do things in the world. So when I pick something up, there are certain neural systems that need to operate in a particular way for me to pick up this up. What they found is that, found this in monkeys, that you would track the reaching and grasping neurons in the monkey, and then by total chance, they found that when a person that the monkey was observing reached and grasped something, those same motor neurons became active. So that the way the monkey understood what it was perceiving was to run a simulation of that in its own motor system, which became increasingly clear that we understand the world by modeling the world in our own sensory motor systems. So that's part of what comes into the idea that thinking becomes that kind of simulation. But I just think what happens in dreaming is that you kind of get an unconstrained version of that, and it just kind of gets bizarre and doesn't go anywhere. Or if it has a linkage that seems almost narrative, it's bizarre. And then we wake up and that's what we kind of remember. So I don't think it necessarily argues against it for me. But I think the idea of mirror neurons is really important to think about with respect to what it means to sit and emulate or simulate. It's very similar to our normal thinking processes. So, Lynn, you were about to get up. Are you ready to go to the next? Okay, one more question. Oh, right here. Yeah.
So this is more of a question of understanding. Like, so in trying to understand human, like what a human,
Yeah.
like, did my neurons make me do?
Yeah.
So you're looking inside the system as a human.
Yeah.
The human's a system. You're looking inside the
Yeah.
system and seeing if the neuron has any influence on the system. And obviously that's not working out because the thing is inside the system. But so you're concluding that the environment influences your decisions. You're looking outside the system.
Yes, what we form with respect to a system, yeah.
So what if you just increase the size of the system? Like include the environment. Like, what is the influence? The environment influenced by? It's influenced by Earth.
Yeah, I mean,
You're going deterministic up instead of down.
Yeah. I just don't think that actually flies. But even we as human beings have an incredible variety of situations, and we form with respect to that. And many of those environmental things that we respond to have been created by the thoughts and actions of other individuals. So we are in these incredible, deeply nested interactive loops that is hard to imagine to be determinative to me. I mean, I suppose you could imagine, some sort of, I don't know. The problem with that, by the way, is it's a self-defeating point of view, because if you imagine your thoughts to be determined, either internally or externally, then the thought that you are determined doesn't make any sense. It's not about a real thing, it's just a determined event. You understand what I'm saying? It's sort of like the statement, this statement is a lie. It's kind of a self-defeating position. Because if your belief in that is entirely determined, it can't be a belief based on evidence. It only can be a belief based on a deterministic world. So there are a lot of philosophers that, I don't know. All right?